In these next couple of chapters, we want to talk about a different way to animate 3D called simulation. The problem with many real-life motions is that while they're in principle just simple Newtonian physics, in practice it would be incredibly difficult to animate each box separately and make them interact properly. With simulation, we instead impact the scene with simulated forces like gravity and moving objects, and then just see where it lands, which gives us a very complex result from simple input. The trade-off is that we can't micromanage it like we could with a real animation. Because to, for example, make the boxes fall differently, we'd have to impact them in a different way and hope for the best. But down the line, we can detach individual objects and animate them separately. A couple of things to understand about simulation is first of all that we specifically select which objects to simulate. Out of these 6 boxes, we're only simulating 3 of them. So when the first 3 fall, the last 3 stay in the air. As far as the simulation is concerned, the other 3 objects don't exist, and simulated objects will just pass through them. Secondly, in a simulation, some objects are active and some are passive. Active objects move around and interact, and passive objects, like the floor, simply function as a hard barrier. By changing objects between passive and active, it's possible to keyframe objects like regular animation, but then suddenly make them active and let the simulation control it the rest of the way out. Here we're controlling the ball for the first half, and then let it fall where it may for the second half. Thirdly, simulation is extremely heavy, so if we have a complicated object, animators usually build a low-poly proxy version for the simulation, and then parent the high-poly object to it. It normally looks the same, but it's much faster to simulate. In order to control the simulation, we have a lot of forces called fields. And for physics, we're mostly just interested in gravity fields. Gravity works throughout the scene, and the moment we turn it on, everything falls. Gravity usually defaults to the Earth's gravity. But if it makes sense, we can change gravity to make things fall faster or slower. And sometimes that's just the right tweak. Next, using dozens of extremely technical parameters, we can control how each object reacts to forces. For example, some objects can be made slippery, so other objects slide on them. Or we can give objects a lot of friction, so other objects stop like they're on a carpet. We can also control how bouncy objects are, from extremely bouncy to almost no bounce at all. And we can set how much mass each object has, so that we can, for example, make an iron ball have impact on a paper box, regardless of how big each of them are. In addition, we have a concept called the initial state, which is the starting point at frame 0. And this has a lot to say in the outcome. Depending on where we initially hang the boxes, and especially how they're rotated, we get a lot of different outcomes. There are two primary ways of getting a simulation rolling. And the first is to make the main object passive and then keyframe it to move through the scene. The moment it hits the other boxes, they have to make way. Another way is to trigger objects by manipulating their state. And what this means is that regardless of where an object thinks it's going, we can suddenly make it go at a certain speed in a certain direction. Then out of nowhere, the object suddenly starts moving. And if that happens off camera, nobody will ever know. To see how all these things work together, let's look at the car crash scene. The truck and the Jaguars are extremely high polygon models. So we first of all modeled some simple proxy objects. And then the entire simulation was done with them. Since they have the same shape in every way that matters, the motion will be the same. And for the render, we just parented the real objects to the proxies and made the proxies invisible. The truck is keyframed from start to finish as a passive object. And it's only the Jaguars that are active objects. We tweaked the angle of the impact many times until we got a solution that lifted the car up into the air just right. And landed in front of the camera. But we also used what's called a radial field, like a little blasting charge to help lift the car. And we'll talk about this field in the next chapter. Then we've also added some large debris pieces, which appear in the air just before the truck hits and are then just kicked forwards by the truck. There are many more pieces of debris in the final shot, but those were done with particles. Finally, the impact sends the Jaguar off in the right direction. But that doesn't actually change its shape. So we used a lattice deformer to warp the car. Then the lattice is keyframed to warp every time there's an impact. We've also keyframed the high poly truck to rotate back and forth, as if its shock absorbers are bouncing from the impact. And while it looks great, it's actually very basic keyframe animation. There are many situations where it's better to jump into simulation than it is to sit and mess with animating something to fall the right way. In the T-Rex chase, all the logs and branches were done with physics. It would be pointless work to try to animate these things by hand. Make 3D smoke using millions of tiny polygons, because the render time would be insane. Instead, these are simulated with a particle system, which is a number of theoretical dots in the air that can be rendered as, for example, smoke puffs. and then the particles can be manipulated with fields like this turbulence field. All particles come from an emitter, which spews out a set number of particles per second. Particles are then usually given an artificial size, and are then textured with a smoke texture. The illusion doesn't hold when we only use a few particles. But when we use a lot of big particles and let each particle be almost transparent, they suddenly melt together and produce very convincing smoke. Emitters come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Omni-emitters send out particles in all directions. Directional emitters send out particles in one direction like a spotlight. And volume emitters send out particles from an object. For example, to make a plume of smoke from a chimney. You can also set the overall lifetime for particles so they expire after a while. And you can set all kinds of attributes for how particles are supposed to behave over time, like change color. Emitters can also be moved while they emit. So to, for example, make a smoke trail after an object that's flying on a path, all we have to do is parent an emitter to the object, and then we get automatic smoke. However, emitters on their own output some very boring and mathematical particles. And it's not until we use fields that we get realistic behavior. The gravity field, for example, simply pulls the particles downwards. So to make a fountain, we merely have to point a directional emitter upwards and put in a gravity field. A radial field pushes or pulls particles like a magnet. Here we're spraying some particles. But with a negative radial field, the particles are suddenly pulled towards it. With a positive radial field, they're pushed away and scattered. An air field behaves like a fan, that a stream of particles gets blown to the side. A drag field slows down objects that move into it. And it's, for example, common to have pretty fast particles coming out of the emitter, but then a drag field to simulate friction in the air. And finally, in this quick sampling, a turbulence field creates disturbances in the air. And many effects don't look right if the particles don't disperse after a while. The reason we're showing this is that the only way to change how particles behave is to change the forces that influence them. We've used particles quite a bit in this course. For example, to do the pixie dust in the fairy shot. In the car crash scene, smoke comes out of the Jaguar's engine. And at the end, the air is filled with smoke. This was simply done by attaching an emitter to the bottom of the car. And then at the moment of impact, we turn the emitter on full throttle. We're emitting about 3,000 particles per second. Which together make solid smoke. We also have a turbulence field to make sure that the particles scatter after a while. In the T-Rex scene, we had a far more elaborate particle setup. We first of all attached a particle emitter to each foot. And then we animated them to turn on and emit particles like crazy for a couple of frames. To mimic real-life dust, we emit particles at a very high speed. But then we have a drag field that quickly slows the particles down and lets them hang in the air. We also have a turbulence field to slowly disperse the particles so they don't just sit there. And finally, we added a nice touch that you can't really see in the final composite, which is that we have an airfield with a small radius attached to each foot, so that when it lifts up, the vacuum pulls on the particles. But as we said, it's not really visible in the final composite. Particles are great for this kind of stuff. But the big problem is that each particle is an individual and has no awareness of where the other particles are. To make effects like water, particles need to push and pull on their neighbors. So many particle effects are now actually done with what's called a fluid simulation. Fluid simulations are like advanced particles. Here we're just showing some presets from Maya's fluid simulator. And you can get some very realistic water effects very easily. Many particle effects are in fact better done with fluids because the smoke seems more solid. And here each snowflake pushes and pulls its neighbors, which gives a more realistic movement. A key point in fluids is that it has actual mass, which means that it also blocks light the thicker it is. A big part of the realism here is that the smoke becomes too thick to let the light out. Fluids can also make very realistic fire effects, because the way flames work comes very naturally to fluids. And fluids make excellent clouds. These clouds are a bit blobby, but we're looking at some clouds later that look almost real. Fully animated objects are characters, and a new kind of action movie was born. This process is called instancing, and all we're really doing is rendering the particles as geometry. Then we simply emit probes with an emitter, and we can control their flight by putting in fields. The downside to instancing is that the probes will move as a group and not have much individual personality. So it's common to pull out a couple of objects that are close to the camera and animate them by hand. We also used instancing in the car crash shot. We felt that it was very important to shatter the Jaguar's windshield, but to do it economically, we did it using particles. We first used a feature that allows particles to be emitted from objects, to emit a ton of particles from the windshield in the moments before the crash. Then we built 4 or 5 different pieces of glass, instanced them to the particles, and made the computer randomize the sizes and rotations. Then when the truck hits, the glass is thrown around everywhere and also bounces on the ground. The car crash shot still looks a little 3D. But one of the main keys to realistic car crashes is to smother the scene in particles and debris. We also used instancing in the crowd replication scene. This time we created 45 templates. And then we used yet another feature of particles where you can literally spray paint particles on a surface. Afterwards, we have particles that are stuck on the surface. In the crowd scene, we then simply instance the 45 cells onto the particles and ask the computer to randomize the copying. And then we had crowd replication. The danger in random selection is that we might end up with identical copies of a person next to each other. But that can be fixed if it's really a problem. But in practice, you need some help. So here we're using a plugin called Blast Code, which is the standard for demolition in Maya. Demolitions first of all need to pre-break the objects, just like you do in miniature effects. And in Blast Code, that's done with a drawing of where the breaks are supposed to be. Additionally, all small objects are just done with particle instancing to save on the math. That means that only the big pieces have proper collision, but in practice you can't see it. Finally, you typically also add regular particle smoke to simulate superfine particles. The next simulation is cloth simulation, where we can turn any object into cloth and have it react with the scene. Even this ultra-basic simulation here would be virtually impossible to do by hand. Under the hood, cloth works almost like particles and fluids. So we can impact it with forces, like this air field that makes the cloth blow in the wind. So it's possible to direct a cloth simulation using common sense words. Cloth objects also have all kinds of properties like bounce, friction, and mass, or resistance to stretching or bending. And all these again do pretty much what you'd expect. The only thing that's sometimes confusing is that cloth needs to settle in before the scene actually starts. So many animations need to start 50 frames ahead of time where nothing seems to happen. But all you need to worry about is what happens after you cut into the shot. And finally, hair simulation is something that used to be very exclusive, but now is a fast and easy thing to do. Originally, hair was called fur and was rendered one strand at a time. But it's very expensive to render long hair this way, so now it's only used for short hair. For long hair, we instead have what's called follicles with curves coming out of them. And then each curve represents a whole bunch of hair. Surprisingly, it doesn't bother you very much in the final render. And if it does, you can just make each hair bundle thinner and use more follicles. But it still renders a lot faster. It's possible to control hair extremely specifically. For example, by weaving the curves, which produces braiding. It's also possible to paint a map for which color hair each follicle produces. And each follicle can produce different length hair, which makes it possible to actually do hairstyling. Best of all, hair has physics built in, so we get automatic secondary animation when we move the character. And we can even use fields to make wind. So hair used to be very high-end, but it's now an everyday thing to do. character simulation is a whole other ballgame from simple Newtonian physics. Because characters aren't just dead objects that need to fall to the ground. Instead, characters are animated using goals and artificial intelligence. So that if a character's goal is to stand up and you push him, he'll do what he can to remain upright. You can do things to digital stunt people that would be incredibly difficult to do with real actors. But the main obstacle, of course, is that somebody has to model and skin and rig some digital actors. That's doable if you're on at least some sort of budget. And it works great for characters who aren't close to the camera. It's harder to do close-up 3D characters because the quality has to be much better. To direct motion synthesis, you again describe it in pretty much real-world terms. Then the animator puts all these goals and forces on the timeline. So for example, a goal to stay upright only lasts for maybe 100 frames. And then he's free to fall afterwards. Things like running, jumping, falling, and clambering are all extremely easy to do with motion synthesis. But digital stunt people aren't actors, and you shouldn't expect to be able to fully control them. In order to control the performance before and after the actual stunt, motion synthesis integrates with motion capture. Then the first half is a motion capture or a character animation. But then we suddenly switch into simulation, and the software takes it from there. Motion synthesis is fascinating. And if you have enough budget to model some 3D extras, or buy them if stock characters are good enough for you, then digital stunt people are totally within reach, even if you're not on a blockbuster budget. Composites would be radically different if we were using Shake or Nuke or Inferno. Before we go through some composites, we want to cover some of the nodes we use a lot. Their names are fusion-centric, but these functions are part of every software. We'll assume that you already understand node-based compositing. But in any case, you know that we start with loaders that bring in footage. Then we use merge nodes to composite things in. And finally, we have a saver that writes it back to disk. A merge node uses the alpha channel when it composites something on top. So if we have this 3D element, which comes with an alpha channel, the merge node only does something where the alpha channel is white. Live action footage doesn't come with an alpha channel, so we have to make one either by running it through a mat control node, where we manually cut things out using garbage mats, which is usually difficult, or we can run green screen footage through a keyer, which makes a mat from the green. Then the merge node knows which parts to replace and which parts to keep. For keying, we've been using Ultimat throughout the course, which is our favorite keyer. In the vast majority of cases, you make a key simply by selecting a point that you feel represents the average green. Then you go to the mat view and select spots where you want to make the mat stronger. It's primarily spill that's responsible for these holes in the mat. But the problem is that the more you try to make spill areas solid, the more you torture the key. That's why for quality keying, the single most important thing you can do is use spill cloth on the set. And we're completely serious, there's nothing as important. Now, even with a good key, we need to garbage mat out the junk on the set, and this is the real use for the matte control node. The node works by taking geometric shapes as input. And then we can paint the matte with a spline. Garbage mats by nature select the parts we want to remove. So if we look at the alpha channel, this part is now black. But we have a button to invert the matte. And now we've selected the part we want to include instead. In addition, matte control nodes let us blur mattes, or expand and shrink them, or clamp them. But the less we use these tools, the better, because they always hurt the matte. But sometimes you have to. If we're not interested in a matte, but just want to blend the source on top, like this cloud pass from one of the upcoming composites. Merge nodes also have all the blend modes you'd know from Photoshop, like screen. So here we're screening the clouds on top, which didn't require a matte. But as in Photoshop, nobody really knows what any of them do, except for normal and screen and multiply, so those are the ones you always use. A merge node also lets you position and rotate and scale things as part of merging them, and we use that a lot. But this function is also available separately in a node called Transform, which you'll see once in a while in our composites. Next, for some actual signal processing, we first have a brightness contrast node, which is a really simple, quick and dirty tool for level adjustment. Its big brother is the color corrector, which is a major tool that we use a lot. The tool does hue saturation, level and gamma adjustment, and color suppression. And it can do this on the entire image, or only on certain brightness ranges like shadows, midtones, or highlights. And these ranges can be controlled. Altogether, this is very sophisticated, especially if we also start using keyers to only correct isolated areas of an image. Finally, in this short list, you'll often see a channel booleans node, which does channel math, and this is something you need. It has two inputs, and you can select first a math operation like multiply, add, subtract, negative, and so on. And then how each channel is copied or calculated to the output. This one here does nothing to the red, green, and blue channels, but uses the red channel of input 2 as the new alpha channel. As we go along, it'll become clear why this is handy. These are the most typical nodes we're using, and we'll explain any others when we get to them. So let's get started. The backmost element is the ocean and sky dome here, which is a separate pass rendered out from Maya with the airplanes and 3D clouds disabled. For an element as complex as an ocean, it's always easier to render it as a separate pass. So we can re-render it for tweaking without having to re-render everything else. We're building the flow in this direction. So you're mostly seeing merge nodes here that add elements. And then we have various chains coming in from each side. The next element we're adding is the airplane itself, which plays like this. The plane in the background is part of this pass, but if we wanted depth of field, it would have been easier to render the rear plane separately. They also come with a mat. After the loader node, we only do a little bit of color correction. The F-16 in the render was too blue for our taste, so we're just desaturating it a little. And then we merge it into the assembly line. The next element is the green screen plate up here, which we've seen a few times. If you remember, we placed the image plane inside the cockpit and shot it with the final extended camera, so the size adapts perfectly. The first thing we do to the green screen plate is an Ultimatte node, which does an excellent key on basically default settings. Immediately after, we have a matte control node, where we incorporate a garbage mat from up here, which cleans out the surroundings. The mat is animated to move along with the footage. Right now, we'll disable all the other nodes in this chain, so we're only seeing the loader, the keyer, and the matte control. And then we can look at what we've done so far. She composites fine, but she needs to be matted to stay inside the plane. That's what this side chain is for. We could just do manual garbage mats to mask her, but instead we've rendered out pieces of the airplane, which is an easy way to mask people inside 3D objects. We're not really interested in the piece itself, more its mat. But this piece only works for the front of the plane. So we've rendered a second piece of the backside, which is active from frame 250 or so. And again, it's the mat we're after. Then we do some channel math to get these two mats turned into one. First, we start with a background, which is black, but it has a full-on mat. And then using these two channel Booleans nodes, we subtract each 3D mat, which gives us a mat where both pieces are excluded. And here comes the backside piece. Then over here in the green screen chain, we use another channel Booleans, which multiplies the green screen chain with the mat. And that mats are inside the plane. At the end, she doesn't really rotate properly with the plane. So we've added this transform node up here, which animates a rotate at the end. And just before the merge node, we're also color correcting the green screen chain. We're just desaturating it to match the scene. And here's how the merge node is playing. The rotate at the end is still not good enough, but somehow we can't see it as soon as she's inside the glass. So next is the glass, and that's made of 2 clips. First we have a flat version, which doesn't look like much. But we're doing it to get the mat. The second clip is this one, which includes both the plane and the sky, although the sky is only visible in the reflections. We're doing it like this because glass in a black scene would just be black. We've also made the glass 100% reflective like a mirror. And then we'll do the transparency in the way we composite it. So up here, the first thing we're doing is darkening the background behind the glass as a sort of tint. And we're doing that with a color corrector inserted into the main chain. The color corrector has a matte input for limiting the effect area, which is driven by the alpha channel from the flat version. The end result is that we darken the main chain where the glass is, including the actor who was merged earlier. Next we have the glass itself, which we first color correct. Just a little less saturation because the 3D was too heavy on blue. Then we have a channel booleans, which we're using to multiply the alpha channel from the plain version, to cut out the fuselage and keep just the glass. And then we're compositing the glass on top, which we're screening on top to blend instead of replace. And we're also about 50% transparent. Finally, we have a cloud pass, which was rendered with everything else black, so the clouds can composite right in and will go behind the plane. The clouds are done with Maya fluids at pretty much default settings, so if you ever want these clouds in a scene, you can get the exact same ones. We're again screening the clouds on top to keep some transparency. And then we save the composite back to disk. And here it is. It's perhaps worth noting that all these passes come from the same 3D scene. When everything was in the right place, we simply saved and rendered 7 or 8 different versions, turning things on and off. It's always easier to break a scene up into elements and tweak them separately than it is to render every element every time we have a tweak. The downside is that once you start rendering passes, you really can't go back because then every pass has to be done again. Works almost the same way as the F-16 composite. We start by loading a clip down here, and then we have a main trunk that runs through here, ending in a saver over here. This entire subchain here is only about making mats for the live-action actor, to make him go in front of all the 3D elements we're putting in. So the first element we're loading is of course the plate.